sky of the late 1930s belonged to the biplane and the single-engine racer. Aviation was evolving, but it was still clinging to the familiar shapes that had emerged from the Great War. When the United States Army Air Corps looked toward the future, they envisioned incremental improvements, faster engines, sleeker bodies, but fundamentally the same designs. Then out of a secret hangar in California emerged a machine that looked like a hallucination. It had two tails. It had a central pod that looked more like a weapon than a cockpit. It did not hum. It screamed. To the traditionalists, it was an engineering monstrosity. To the pilots who would eventually master it, it was the future. But innovation in war is rarely welcomed with open arms. It is usually met with skepticism, fear, and the crushing weight of failure. In this war, battles were won not just by bullets, but by the audacious refusal to accept that the laws of physics were absolute. At the War Perspective, we believe the best way to honor the past is to never let it be forgotten. If you believe in that mission, hit the subscribe button and join us on this journey. Now let us return to the skies over the Pacific and the drawing boards of Burbank, where a legend was about to be born. The story of the P-38 Lightning began not with a battle, but with a piece of paper. In 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608. It was a wish list that bordered on fantasy. The military wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of flying at 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, reaching that altitude in 6 minutes or less. At the time, the frontline fighters of the world struggled to break 300 miles per hour. The generals were asking for a machine that did not exist, and according to the prevailing engineering wisdom of the day, could not exist. At the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, a young, abrasive, and brilliant engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson looked at the requirements. Johnson was not interested in incremental improvements. He realized immediately that the standard single-engine design favored by every other manufacturer would never achieve the requested speed or rate of climb. The engines of the day simply did not have the horsepower to drag a heavy airframe through the thick lower atmosphere fast enough to meet the Army's demands. Johnson's solution was radical. If one engine was insufficient, he would use two. But simply bolting two engines onto the wings of a standard fuselage created too much drag and disrupted the airflow over the control surfaces. He needed a way to streamline the power. He sketched a design that looked unlike anything the Army had ever seen. He placed the pilot and the armament in a central, isolated nacelle. The engines, massive 12-cylinder Allisons, were mounted in long, slender booms that extended back to support twin vertical stabilizers. It was a design born of pure aerodynamics, but it frightened the conservative minds in the military procurement office. They worried about the complexity. They worried about the pilot being trapped in the middle. They worried about the sheer size of the thing. It was heavy, weighing nearly twice as much as the fighters it was meant to replace. But Johnson remained adamant. He argued that the twin-boom configuration allowed for the installation of General Electric turbo superchargers inside the booms, behind the engines. These superchargers were critical. They would pump compressed air into the engines, allowing them to breathe in the thin air of high altitudes where the Army wanted this plane to fight. Without the booms, there was no room for the plumbing. Without the plumbing, there was no high-altitude performance. Lockheed gave the project the internal designation Model 22. The team worked in secrecy, often hand-building components because the tooling for such strange shapes did not exist. The aluminum skin was flush-riveted and polished until it shone like a mirror, a desperate attempt to reduce every ounce of parasitic drag. As the prototype took shape, it looked fast even while sitting on the jacks. It sat on a tricycle landing gear, another rarity for the time, which gave it a level stance on the ground, unlike the tail draggers that pointed their noses at the sky. On January 27, 1939, the prototype, designated the XP-38, was ready. It was trucked to March Field in California under the cover of darkness to avoid prying eyes. When Lieutenant Ben Kelsey, the project's test pilot and a staunch advocate for the design, climbed into the cockpit, he sat amidst a clutter of experimental gauges. He fired the twin Allison engines, and the sound was distinct, a throaty, synchronized roar that promised immense power. Kelsey taxied out and pushed the throttles forward. The XP-38 didn't just take off, it leaped. The acceleration was profound. In the air, the plane proved Johnson's math was correct. It was fast, terrifyingly fast. Within days of the initial test flights, the Army decided to see what this strange machine could really do. They authorized a transcontinental flight from California to New York, a publicity stunt intended to show the tax-paying public that their money was being spent on superior technology. Kelsey took off and turned the nose east. He tore across the continent, stopping only twice for fuel. He was flying at speeds that shattered existing records, cruising comfortably above 400 miles per hour with a tailwind. The impossible 360 miles per hour requirement was not just met, it was obliterated. The XP-38 was the fastest thing in the American sky. But the triumph nearly ended in tragedy. As Kelsey approached Mitchell Field in New York, he began his descent. The cold air over the East Coast shock-cooled the engines during the long glide. When he applied power for the final approach, the carburetors iced up. The engines sputtered and choked. Kelsey, fighting a heavy, complex machine that had suddenly become a glider, fell short of the runway. The gleaming silver prototype smashed into a golf course, ripping through the turf and coming to a rest as a crumpled wreck. Kelsey survived, pulling himself from the twisted metal with minor injuries, but the XP-38 was destroyed. The critics pounced. They pointed to the wreck as proof that the design was too dangerous, too complex, and too heavy for a fighter pilot to handle. The program teetered on the edge of cancellation. However, the generals looked past the wreckage on the golf course. They looked at the stopwatch. Kelsey had crossed the continent in 7 hours and 2 minutes. Despite the crash, the performance data was undeniable. The Army Air Corps realized that while the plane might be unforgiving, it possessed a capability that no other nation could match. They did not cancel the program. Instead, they ordered 13 more for testing. Kelly Johnson's gamble had paid off, but the engineering challenges were far from over. The speed that made the P-38 a legend was about to reveal a new, invisible enemy, one that would kill brave pilots before the engineers understood how to fight it. The exhilaration of the initial speed records masked a dark reality that lay hidden in the upper atmosphere. As Lockheed ramped up production of the service test models, designated the YP-38, pilots began to explore the edges of the flight envelope. They climbed to heights where the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and then they tipped the nose over. They wanted to see what the twin Allisons could do in a dive. What they found was a terrifying new phenomenon that aerodynamics textbooks of the time had barely begun to describe. The P-38 was entering a realm of speed where air ceased to behave like a fluid and began to act like a solid. As the Lightning accelerated past 500 miles per hour in a steep dive, the air rushing over the thick curves of the wings accelerated even faster, approaching the speed of sound. Shock waves formed on the upper surfaces of the wings. These invisible walls of compressed air destroyed the smooth flow of lift, and violently turbulent air washed back over the tail. For the pilot in the cockpit, the sensation was the stuff of nightmares. As the speed climbed, The yoke, which normally felt alive and responsive, suddenly froze. It felt as though it had been set in concrete. The pilot would pull back with all his strength, bracing his boots against the rudder pedals and hauling on the stick until his knuckles turned white. But the nose would not rise. The aircraft entered what engineers called compressibility, but what the pilots experienced as a death grip. The shock waves stripped the elevator of its authority. Worse, the center of lift shifted aft, causing the nose to tuck under even steeper. The harder the plane dove, the faster it went. The faster it went, the more the controls locked. The P-38 became a lawn dart, screaming toward the earth at terminal velocity. Panic was the natural reaction. Pilots found themselves trapped in a screaming metal cage, watching the altimeter unwind at a dizzying rate. 20,000 feet, 15,000, 10,000. Some bailed out, tumbling into the freezing air. Others, paralyzed by the G-forces or sheer terror, rode the aircraft down. Those who survived discovered that if they waited long enough, the thicker air at lower altitudes would slow the plane just enough for the shock waves to dissipate, and the controls would suddenly snap back to life. But pulling out at treetop level required nerves of steel and a disregard for one's own mortality. The crisis came to a head on November 4, 1941. Lockheed test pilot Ralph Verdon took a P-38 into the sky to investigate a theory proposed by the Army. The military engineers believed the problem was flutter, a vibration in the tail caused by structural weakness. They wanted Verdon to perform a high-speed dive to test a stiffer elevator design. Kelly Johnson vehemently disagreed. He argued that the problem was aerodynamic, not structural. He warned that stiffening the tail would not solve the compressibility issue and might actually make the recovery forces violent enough to tear the plane apart. Verdon, a professional committed to the data, initiated the dive. He pushed the P-38 toward the danger zone. As the speed built, the compressibility took hold. At some point during the recovery attempt, the forces on the tail became catastrophic. The structure failed. The twin booms twisted, and the tail section disintegrated. Verdon's P-38 tumbled out of the sky and crashed, killing him instantly. The tragedy cast a pall over the program. The Army was ready to ground the fleet, convinced the design was fundamentally flawed. But Johnson was already working on the solution. He utilized a high-speed wind tunnel, a rare luxury at the time, and confirmed his hypothesis. The thick wing of the P-38, designed for high lift, was accelerating the airflow to supersonic speeds too early. The shock wave was killing the lift over the tail. Johnson realized he could not redesign the entire wing without scrapping the project. Instead, he needed a way to manage the airflow. He and his team developed a small, hinged panel on the underside of the wing, just outboard of the engines. They called it a dive flap. It was not an air brake intended to slow the plane down, although it did create drag. Its primary purpose was to disrupt the airflow in a specific way, forcing the shock wave to move and restoring a clean stream of air to the elevator. When the dive flaps were deployed, they created a wedge of pressure that lifted the wing's center of lift back to its normal position. The effect was immediate. A pilot in a high-speed dive could deploy the flaps, and within seconds, the concrete feeling vanished from the stick. The nose could be pulled up. Control returned. It was a brilliant, elegant engineering fix to a problem that was on the cutting edge of physics. With the dive flaps installed, the P-38 was no longer a death trap in a dive. It was now capable of plunging from the heavens at speeds that would rip the wings off other fighters and then recovering to fight again. The engineers had tamed the compressibility crisis, but the delay had been costly. War was raging in Europe, and the Pacific was a powder keg waiting to explode. The P-38 was finally safe to fly, but now it had to prove it was safe to fight. The Lightning was about to leave the California sun and head for the gray, contested skies of the war. The war in Europe was a distant thunder to the factory workers in Burbank, but the machines they built were destined to bridge that gap. Before the P-38 could fight the Luftwaffe, it had to defeat the Atlantic Ocean. In the summer of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces initiated Operation Bolero, a massive logistical undertaking to ferry combat aircraft from North America to the British Isles. For single-engine fighters, this journey was a logistical nightmare involving crates, ships, and reassembly. But the P-38 was different. It had the range. It had the redundancy of two engines. And so the Lightnings were ordered to fly. They gathered in the cold winds of Maine, then hopped to Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, and finally Scotland. It was a perilous journey over freezing black water, guided only by primitive radio navigation and the steady hum of the Allisons. The sight of P-38s appearing out of the mist in the United Kingdom was the first signal to the European theater that the American approach to air power was fundamentally different. They did not just send airplanes, they sent long-range machines that could traverse hemispheres under their own power. But the Lightning's true crucible was not the gray skies of England, but the blinding sands of North Africa. Following the Allied landings in Operation Torch in late 1942, the P-38s were redeployed to the Mediterranean. They arrived at forward airfields in Algeria and Tunisia, landing on perforated steel planking laid hastily over the desert dust. The environment was harsh. The sand worked its way into every seal and bearing. The heat tested the cooling systems to their limits. Yet as the pilots acclimated to the desert, the German and Italian pilots patrolling the other side of the line began to notice a new shape in the sky. To the veterans of the Luftwaffe, accustomed to the single-engine silhouettes of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and the P-40 Warhawk, the P-38 was a baffling anomaly. It looked enormous. At a distance, the twin booms and the wide stance made it resemble a medium bomber or a heavy transport aircraft. German pilots flying the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Butcher Bird FW-190 initially viewed the newcomer with derision. In the dogfighting doctrine of the First World War, which still held sway in many minds, a large, heavy fighter with two engines could not possibly turn tight enough to survive a close-quarters brawl. They expected the P-38 to be a sluggish target, easy meat for their cannon fire. This underestimation proved fatal. The first encounters over Tunisia shattered the Luftwaffe's assumptions. The German pilots dove on what they thought were clumsy, heavy fighters, only to find that the Lightning, despite its size, possessed a surprising agility when handled correctly. More importantly, it possessed vertical performance that was simply unmatched. When a Messerschmitt pilot tried to climb away from an engagement, relying on the superior climb rate that had saved him against British fighters, he found the P-38 right behind him. The Lightning's turbo superchargers kept the engines gasping deep breaths of air long after the German engines began to wheeze in the thin atmosphere. The confusion among the Axis forces was palpable. The P-38 defied categorization. It was too fast to be a bomber, yet it had the range of one. It was too large to be a dogfighter, yet it could initiate a high-speed slash attack and vanish into the vertical before the enemy could bring their guns to bear. The distinct silhouette became a source of anxiety. Axis spotters, scanning the horizon with binoculars, learned to look for the ladder shape, the horizontal wing connected to the horizontal stabilizer by the two vertical booms. Furthermore, the P-38 brought a peculiar acoustic quality to the battlefield. The turbo superchargers, buried deep within the booms, acted as massive mufflers for the engine exhaust. While a formation of Bf-109s announced their arrival with a harsh, metallic growl, the P-38s approached with a low, smooth hum that was often difficult to hear until it was too late. This silent approach allowed American flights to stalk German transport formations, slipping in unnoticed to wreak havoc on the supply lines that were the lifeblood of Rommel's Africa Corps. The pilots of the 1st Fighter Group and the 14th Fighter Group, the pioneers of the Lightning in combat, learned quickly that they could not fight the Japanese Zero or the German Bf-109 on the enemy's terms. If they tried to turn horizontally, they died. The P-38 was not a ballerina. It was a peregrine falcon. The American pilots developed energy tactics, using their superior speed and altitude performance to dictate the engagement. They would dive, strike, and zoom, climb back up to the safety of altitude, converting kinetic energy into potential energy with an efficiency that frustrated their opponents. By early 1943, the skies over Tunisia had become a killing ground. The initial confusion of the Axis pilots had curdled into a genuine respect and then into fear. The Lightning was effectively strangling the air bridge between Italy and North Africa. The Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, lumbering low over the waves, fell in droves to the roaming packs of P-38s. The Mediterranean, once an Axis lake, was becoming an American shooting gallery. The heavy twin-boom experiment that the critics said would never work was now dismantling the Luftwaffe's logistics one engine at a time. The strange silhouette was no longer a curiosity. It was a harbinger of doom. And as the wreckage of German planes littered the Tunisian desert, the enemy pilots began to whisper a new name for this terror, a name that acknowledged both its shape and its lethality. The name appeared first in interrogation reports, muttered by captured German airmen who had seen their formations shredded. Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the forked-tail devil. It was not a nickname born of mockery, like the flying coffin or iron pig, but a title earned through sheer, unadulterated violence. The Luftwaffe, a force that prided itself on technical superiority and nightly combat, had found itself haunted by a machine that refused to play by the rules. The fear that the P-38 inspired was rooted in its unique armament configuration. In almost every other fighter of the era, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Messerschmitt, the guns were mounted in the wings. This design required the pilot to set a convergence point, a specific distance usually around 250 to 300 yards, where the streams of bullets from the left and right wings would cross. If the pilot fired at a target closer or further than that distance, the bullets would pass harmlessly around the enemy fuselage. It demanded precision in range estimation and forced the pilot to get close, dangerously close, to ensure a kill. The P-38 ignored this limitation entirely. Kelly Johnson had clustered the entire arsenal in the nose of the central pod. 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon were packed tightly together directly in front of the pilot. There was no convergence point. The guns fired straight ahead in a tight, parallel stream that remained lethal out to the maximum effective range of the ammunition. A P-38 pilot could open fire from 800 yards away, distances where a German pilot felt safe, and still land devastating hits. For the victim, the effect was catastrophic. There was no warning spray of bullets bracketing the wings. There was simply a sudden, concentrated buzzsaw of destruction that sawed through fuselages, engines, and cockpits. The 50 caliber rounds punched holes, but the 20mm cannon shells exploded on impact. When a burst from a P-38 connected, it didn't just damage the enemy aircraft, it disintegrated it. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing their wingmen simply vanish in a cloud of debris, struck by a hammer blow from a foe they hadn't even realized was in range. This firepower, combined with the P-38's ability to loiter at high altitudes, fundamentally changed the psychology of the air war over the Mediterranean. The Germans were used to the bounce, diving on unsuspecting enemies, but the P-38s, with their turbo superchargers, could sit comfortably at 30,000 feet, patrolling in the thin, cold air where the Bf-109s struggled to maneuver. From this perch, the American pilots acted as arbiters of the battlefield. They could choose when to fight and when to disengage. One specific engagement in April 1943 solidified the fork-tailed devil legend. Operation Flax was an Allied effort to cut off the Axis retreat from Tunisia. On April 18th, a patrol of P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group spotted a massive formation of German Ju-52 transports skimming the waves, escorted by a swarm of fighters. It was a desperation run, a frantic attempt to evacuate key personnel and equipment before the inevitable surrender. The P-38s descended like wolves. They didn't get tangled in a turning fight with the escorts. Instead, they slashed through the fighter screen and went straight for the transports. The massacre that followed was grimly efficient. The nose-mounted guns tore the slow-moving Junkers apart. The sea below was dotted with burning oil slicks and floating wreckage. In what became known as the Palm Sunday Massacre, the P-38s and other Allied fighters claimed dozens of German aircraft in minutes. It broke the back of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet in the region. The psychological impact on the German pilots was profound. They were fighting a multi-front war, their resources were dwindling, and now they faced an enemy aircraft that seemed to have no weaknesses they could exploit. It was faster in a dive, possessed greater range, and hit harder than anything they had. The fork-tailed devil became a priority target. Luftwaffe commanders issued standing orders: destroy the P-38s at all costs. But the order was easier given than executed. Even when damaged, the P-38 proved incredibly resilient. The twin-engine redundancy meant that a pilot could lose an entire engine to flak or cannon fire and still limp home. Stories began to circulate in the mess halls of Tunisia and later Italy. Stories of P-38s returning with gaping holes in the wings, with tails shredded, with one engine dead and the prop feathered, yet still bringing their pilot back to the steel planking. This survivability endeared the plane to its crews. They knew that in a single-engine fighter, an engine failure over the Mediterranean was a likely death sentence. In the P-38, it was just an emergency procedure. By the time the Allies invaded Sicily and then mainland Italy, the P-38 had cleared the skies. It had swept aside the Regia Aeronautica and the Luftwaffe, turning the Mediterranean into an Allied lake. The distinct hum of its engines was no longer a confusing novelty. It was the sound of air superiority. But while the devil was terrorizing the Germans in Europe, halfway across the world, in the vast waterlogged theater of the Pacific, the P-38 was about to find its true calling. The distances there were not measured in miles, but in hours. And it was there that the Lightning would evolve from a tactical terror into a strategic necessity. If the Mediterranean proved the P-38 was lethal, the Pacific proved it was indispensable. In Europe, the war was fought over densely populated landscapes, a patchwork of fields and cities where landmarks were plentiful and airfields were rarely more than an hour away. The Pacific theater was a different universe entirely. It was a war of specks, tiny islands scattered across millions of square miles of empty, unforgiving blue water. Here the enemy was not just the Japanese Imperial Navy, it was the tyranny of distance. For the planners in Washington, the geography of the Pacific presented a tactical nightmare. The standard single-engine fighters of the day, the stubby Grumman Wildcat and the sturdy P-40 Warhawk, were tethered to their bases by short fuel ranges. They could defend the fleet or they could defend an island, but they could not project power. They could not reach out and strike the enemy in their own backyard. The bombers could go the distance, but flying unescorted into the teeth of Japanese defenses was a recipe for slaughter. Enter General George Kenney, the commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific area. Kenney was a pragmatist who understood the brutal math of his theater. He looked at the P-38 Lightning and saw the only solution to his problem. While commanders in Europe were still debating the aircraft's role, Kenney was begging for every Lightning he could get his hands on. He didn't just want a fighter, he wanted a long-range hunter. The P-38 arrived in the Pacific like a revelation. Its internal fuel tanks carried enough gas for long patrols. But with drop tanks, external fuel pods slung under the wings, the Lightning's range became staggering. It could fly for hours, covering distances that were previously thought impossible for a fighter aircraft. Suddenly, the Japanese, who had grown accustomed to the short leash of American air power, found their sanctuaries violated. Airfields and anchorages deep behind the lines, places like the fortress of Rabaul, were suddenly swarming with twin-boom devils. For the American pilots, the P-38 offered something even more valuable than range. It offered a psychological lifeline. Flying over the Pacific was a haunting experience. If a single engine failed in a Wildcat or a Corsair hundreds of miles from the fleet, the pilot was going into the water. In the vastness of the ocean, rescue was unlikely. Sharks, exposure, and isolation awaited. The P-38 changed the equation. The second engine was not just for speed, it was a round-trip ticket. Pilots told stories of flying hundreds of miles home on a single turning prop, the dead engine feathered and silent, blessing the genius of Kelly Johnson with every mile. This confidence allowed them to push deeper, to take risks that single-engine pilots simply could not justify. However, the combat environment was radically different from Europe. The primary adversary, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was the antithesis of the Lightning. The Zero was featherlight, unarmored, and possessed of a maneuverability that defied belief. In a slow-turning dogfight, a Zero could eat a P-38 alive. The Japanese pilots were skilled, disciplined veterans who knew how to wring every ounce of performance from their agile machines. The initial clashes were a learning curve written in blood. American pilots who tried to turn with the Zeros died, but those who understood the physics of energy warfare thrived. The P-38 doctrine in the Pacific became a mantra of boom and zoom. The Lightning pilots would use their superior climbing ability to loiter high above the Japanese formations. They would spot the enemy, roll over, and dive. The speed of the P-38 in a dive was something the Zero could not match. The American fighters would scream down, their nose-mounted guns tearing into the fragile Japanese airframes. Before the surviving Zeros could even bank to return fire, the Lightnings would use their momentum to zoom climb back into the thin air, defying gravity with the energy they had built up. It was a tactic of discipline. It required the pilot to resist the urge to turn and fight, to accept that the kill was only possible if the rules of engagement were strictly dictated by altitude and speed. This style of fighting produced the greatest American aces of the war. Major Richard Bong, a farm boy from Wisconsin, used the P-38 to claim 40 confirmed victories, becoming the top-scoring American ace of all time. His rival and friend, Major Thomas Maguire, claimed 38. These men were not winning because they were winning turning fights. They were winning because the P-38 allowed them to hunt. They roamed the vast spaces between islands, catching Japanese transport formations, bomber wings, and fighter patrols unawares. The Japanese pilots found themselves in a bind. They could not climb high enough to catch the P-38s before the attack began, and they could not dive fast enough to catch them as they fled. The fork-tailed devil was untouchable if flown correctly. The psychological impact on the Japanese air arm was devastating. They were losing their veteran pilots at an alarming rate, shot down by an enemy they often couldn't touch. By 1943, the P-38 had effectively shrunk the Pacific Ocean. It had turned the vast distances from a defensive barrier for the Japanese into an offensive highway for the Americans. The skies over New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines were patrolled by the distinctive twin silhouettes. But the greatest testament to the P-38's range and precision was yet to come. It would be a mission of such audacity, involving such precise timing over such a vast distance, that it would sound like fiction. It was a mission that would target the very heart of the Japanese Imperial Navy, and it was a mission that only one aircraft in the world could execute. April 14, 1943, a secret listening post in the Pacific intercepted a coded message that would change the course of the war. The transmission detailed the inspection itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. The message was precise. It listed the exact time he would arrive at Balal Airfield near Bougainville, the number of escort fighters, and the type of aircraft he would be flying. For the American intelligence officers who deciphered the code, the opportunity was breathtaking. Yamamoto was more than an admiral. He was the spiritual center of the Japanese naval effort. Killing him would be a blow to morale from which the Imperial Navy might never recover. But the logistics were daunting. Bougainville was deep in enemy territory, over 400 miles from the nearest American fighter base at Guadalcanal. Admiral Nimitz gave the order, "Get Yamamoto." But there was a catch. The mission had to be flown at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar. It required radio silence, and it required pinpoint navigation over hundreds of miles of featureless ocean to intercept a moving target at a specific minute in time. The Navy's F-4U Corsairs didn't have the range. The Army's P-40s were too slow. There was only one option. The 339th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38G Lightnings, got the call. Major John W. Mitchell, the squadron commander, planned the mission with obsessive detail. To make the 1,000-mile round trip, the P-38s needed to be fitted with massive 310-gallon drop tanks, flown in specifically for the operation. Even with the extra fuel, the margin for error was razor thin. They would fly a circuitous route, hooking far to the west and then north, staying well clear of the Japanese lookout posts in the New Georgia Islands. They would arrive at the interception point at exactly 09:35 a.m., just as Yamamoto's flight was scheduled to begin its descent. On the morning of April 18, 16 P-38s roared off the dirt strip at Guadalcanal. They were heavy, sluggish with fuel, and struggling to climb in the humid tropical air. As they leveled off just 50 feet above the water, the pilots settled into a long, tense silence. For 2 hours, the only sound was the drone of the engines and the wind rushing over the canopy. They navigated by dead reckoning, relying on compass headings, airspeed, and a stopwatch. There were no landmarks, just the endless, rolling blue of the Pacific. The tension in the cockpits was palpable. If they were early, they would be spotted and run out of fuel waiting. If they were late, they would miss the admiral entirely. Every pilot knew that if they were shot down or suffered a mechanical failure, there would be no rescue. They were ghosts flying into the heart of the enemy's lair. At 09:34 a.m., exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, the silence broke. Bogies, 11 o'clock high, Captain Thomas Lanfear broke radio silence. There, against the backdrop of the jungle-covered island of Bougainville, were two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers descending toward the airfield. Above them, 6 Zero fighters flew cover. Mitchell's navigation had been perfect. The intercept was textbook. The P-38s dropped their fuel tanks and surged upward. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. They had felt safe deep within their own defensive perimeter, convinced that no American fighter could reach them. The sudden appearance of 16 Lightnings screaming up from the wave tops was a shock. The killer flight, 4 P-38s designated to attack the bombers, tore into the formation. The Zeros dove to intercept, but it was too late. The Lightnings used their speed to slash through the defense. Lieutenant Rex Barber banked his P-38 and lined up on one of the Betty bombers. He pressed the trigger. The nose-mounted 50 calibers and 20mm cannon shuttered the airframe. Rounds walked along the fuselage and into the right engine of the bomber. The Betty shuddered. Smoke began to trail from the engine. Then abruptly the wing failed. The bomber rolled violently to the left and plunged into the jungle canopy below. A massive pillar of black smoke erupted from the crash site. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had awakened the sleeping giant, was dead. The P-38s didn't linger. Fuel was critical. They turned for home, leaving chaos in their wake. The return flight was a white-knuckle endurance test against dwindling fuel gauges. When they finally touched down at Guadalcanal, some of the planes had less than 10 gallons of gas remaining in their tanks. As the pilots climbed out, exhausted and soaked in sweat, the magnitude of what they had done began to sink in. The Vengeance mission was the longest fighter intercept of the war. It was a feat of airmanship and engineering that defied the expectations of the era. No other fighter in the Allied inventory could have flown that distance, at that altitude, with that payload, and still had the combat performance to fight off Zeros and shoot down a bomber. The death of Yamamoto was a turning point. It robbed Japan of its most capable strategist and sent a chilling message to every Japanese commander. There was nowhere to hide. The P-38 had proven that the American reach was limitless, but as the war progressed, the Lightning's role began to shift again. The skies were being cleared of enemy fighters, and the invasion of Europe was looming. The fork-tailed devil was about to trade its air-to-air dominance for a new, grittier mission, one that would bring it down from the high altitudes to the mud and chaos of the battlefield. By late 1943 and early 1944, the nature of the air war in Europe had shifted fundamentally. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was grinding the Luftwaffe into dust, and while air superiority was not yet absolute, it was no longer a desperate dream. The P-38 Lightning, having proven itself as a high-altitude interceptor and a long-range escort, now faced a new evolution. The generals looked at the twin booms and the massive wing area and saw not just a dogfighter, but a truck. They realized that the very features that made the Lightning a heavy fighter, lifting power, stability, and twin-engine redundancy, made it an ideal platform for a grittier, deadlier trade, tactical ground attack. The transition from the fork-tailed devil of the stratosphere to the Jabo, Jagd bomber, of the treetops was driven by simple physics. The P-38 possessed a payload capacity that rivaled the early models of the B-17 Flying Fortress. While a P-51 Mustang or a P-47 Thunderbolt could carry a respectable load, the P-38 could haul 4,000 pounds of ordnance. It could lift two 2,000-pound bombs or a cluster of high-velocity rockets and still retain the range to strike deep into the heart of occupied France and Germany. This capability gave birth to one of the most ingenious field modifications of the war, the droop snoot. The concept was the brainchild of Colonels Cass Howe and Dan Ostrander. They realized that while fighter bombers were effective, they lacked the precision of dedicated bombers. A pilot flying a single-seat fighter had to fly the plane, navigate, avoid flak, and aim his bombs simultaneously. Accuracy often suffered. The solution was radical. They took a standard P-38, removed the nose armament, the beloved cluster of machine guns and cannon, and replaced it with a plexiglass nose cone containing a Norden bomb sight and a seat for a bombardier. This modified lead ship would guide a formation of standard, bomb-laden P-38s. When the bombardier in the glass nose released his payload, the rest of the formation would drop on his signal. It transformed a squadron of fighters into a precision bombing wing that could strike bridges, fuel depots, and rail yards with devastating accuracy from high altitude, and then dive to defend themselves if the Luftwaffe appeared. However, it was at low altitude that the P-38 truly terrified the German ground forces. The Lightning became the scourge of the Wehrmacht's logistics. Train busting became a primary sport for the pilots. They would roam the countryside, hunting the steam locomotives that kept the German war machine fed. The P-38's concentrated nosefire was particularly effective against boilers. A short burst from the 20mm cannon and the 50 calibers could pierce the pressurized iron, causing the locomotive to explode in a catastrophic cloud of superheated steam. The pilots learned to attack these targets with a mix of aggression and caution. They knew that flying through the debris of an exploding train was a quick way to lose an aircraft. They developed a rhythm: dive, fire, pull up hard to clear the explosion, and then circle back to strafe the stopped cars. The silence of the P-38s often meant that the train crews never heard them coming until the rounds were already impacting the steel. Yet this new role exposed the Lightning's greatest vulnerability. In the thin air of 30,000 feet, the P-38 was king. But down in the mud and the flak, it had an Achilles heel. The liquid-cooled Allison engines relied on large radiators mounted in the booms to keep from overheating. These radiators were expansive targets. A single lucky bullet from a German infantryman's rifle or a piece of flak could puncture the cooling system. Once the coolant drained, the engine would seize within minutes. While the second engine allowed the pilot to limp home, the P-38 was not as ruggedly indifferent to ground fire as the air-cooled radial engine P-47 Thunderbolt, which could absorb punishment that would drop a Lightning. Despite this fragility, the P-38s pressed the attack. During the build-up to D-Day, they were instrumental in the transportation plan, systematically dismantling the rail and road networks of northern France. They cut the bridges over the Seine and the Loire, isolating the Normandy battlefield. When the invasion fleet finally crossed the Channel on June 6, 1944, the P-38s were there. Distinctive invasion stripes painted in bold black and white bands around their twin booms to prevent friendly fire. They formed a protective umbrella over the beaches, the first aircraft many American GIs saw as they waded ashore. As the Allied armies broke out of the beachheads and raced across France, the P-38 served as their flying artillery. The integration of air and ground power reached new heights. Forward air controllers, embedded with the tank columns, would radio for support, and the Lightnings would roll in, dropping napalm and high explosives on German strongpoints, often just yards ahead of the advancing Shermans. The P-38J and L models, the definitive versions of the aircraft, featured hydraulic dive flaps and boosted ailerons, allowing pilots to maneuver the heavy fighter with a lightness that belied its size, twisting through the valleys and tree lines to dig out the enemy. The psychological effect on the German retreat was absolute. The roads back to the Rhine became graveyards of vehicles. The Lightning pilots described the carnage as shooting fish in a barrel. Columns of trucks, horse-drawn artillery, and panicked infantry were caught in the open, hammered by the relentless strafing runs. The fork-tailed devil was no longer just a high-altitude phantom. It was a constant, screaming presence that made movement by day suicidal for the Axis forces. By the winter of 1944, the P-38 had effectively done it all. It had cleared the skies, sunk the ships, broken the trains, and paved the way for the tanks. It had evolved from a fragile prototype into a tactical juggernaut. But as the war entered its final bloody act, the age of the propeller was beginning to fade. The jets were coming. Yet even in the twilight of the piston engine, the Lightning had one final legacy to cement. A legacy not just of destruction, but of an enduring symbol of American industrial audacity. As the spring of 1945 warmed the battered landscapes of Europe and the Pacific, the P-38 Lightning stood at the apex of piston engine technology. It had traveled a long, arduous road from the drawing board in Burbank. It had overcome the deadly compressibility crisis, weathered the skepticism of the generals, and survived the harsh trials of combat in every theater of the war. It was the only American fighter aircraft to remain in continuous production from the attack on Pearl Harbor to VJ Day, a testament to the fundamental soundness of Kelly Johnson's radical vision. However, the sky it dominated was changing. The German Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had appeared over Europe. It was a harbinger of a new age, a machine that moved without propellers and flew at speeds that made even the Lightning look static. Yet in those final chaotic months, the P-38 held its ground. It was the Lightning, with its high-speed dive capability, that often chased down the elusive jets, catching them during takeoff or landing, or diving from extreme altitudes to score hits before the German pilots could accelerate out of range. It was the old guard holding the line against the future. In the Pacific, the war ended with the P-38 firmly established as the supreme killer of Japanese air power. It had accounted for more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other fighter in the U.S. Army Air Force's inventory. It was the chariot of the giants. The top two American aces of the war, Majors Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire, scored all their victories in the Lightning. They had proved that a heavy, complex, twin-engine machine could outfight the most maneuverable aircraft in the world if flown with discipline and intellect. But peace brought a swift and brutal end to the fork-tailed devil. Almost overnight, the massive armada of Lightnings became obsolete. The jet age, which the P-38 had briefly touched, was now rushing in to replace it. The very company that built the Lightning, Lockheed, was already rolling out the P-80 Shooting Star, a jet fighter also designed by Kelly Johnson. The P-38 had been the bridge between the eras, the final, ultimate expression of what a propeller-driven fighter could be. The fate of thousands of these magnificent machines was ignominious. In the Pacific, where the cost of shipping them back to the United States was deemed too high, they were treated as debris. At air bases in the Philippines and on islands across the South Pacific, bulldozers dug massive pits. Perfectly serviceable P-38s, some with only a handful of flight hours, were pushed into these graves. Their booms were crushed, their wings snapped, and their engines silenced by the weight of the earth. It was a heartbreaking sight for the crews who had kept them flying, a grim reminder that the tools of war are discarded the moment the fighting stops. In the United States, the survivors were flown to desert boneyards like Kingman, Arizona. There, the fork-tailed devils that had terrified the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Navy were lined up in rows that stretched to the horizon. They were stripped of their instruments, their guns, and their engines. Giant guillotines chopped the airframes into scrap aluminum to be melted down for pots, pans, and prefabricated housing. The plane that had screamed across the sky at 400 miles per hour ended its life as an ingot of metal. Yet the legacy of the P-38 Lightning could not be bulldozed or melted down. It had shifted the paradigm of aviation design. It proved that functionality did not have to follow convention. It vindicated the philosophy of the skunk works. Small, secretive teams of engineers given the freedom to innovate without bureaucratic oversight. This philosophy, born with the P-38, would go on to produce the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. For the men who flew it, the P-38 remained a love affair that never faded. They remembered the reassuring thrum of the two Allisons, the incredible visibility from the central pod, and the feeling of absolute power when they pushed the throttles forward. They remembered the plane that brought them home on one engine when any other fighter would have put them in the drink. It was a difficult plane to master, unforgiving of carelessness, but fiercely loyal to those who respected it. As the years passed, the P-38 became a rarity, a museum piece, a ghost. But in the annals of military history, it occupies a singular space. It was the plane that looked like a monster and fought like a demon. It was the machine that shrank the oceans and broke the back of the enemy logistics. It was and remains one of the most audacious and successful gambles in the history of aerial warfare. The P-38 Lightning was never just an airplane. It was a statement of intent. At a time when the world was settling for what was known, Kelly Johnson and his team dared to build the impossible. They took a design that defied every convention of the era. Two tails, a central pod, and a silhouette that looked more like science fiction than a weapon of war. And they forged it into a legend. The forked-tail devil did not just win battles, it changed the psychology of the sky. It terrified the Luftwaffe, dismantled the Japanese air arm, and brought a level of strategic reach that the Allies desperately needed. Its legacy is not found in the aluminum that was scrapped, but in the lives it saved and the history it altered. It proved that in the face of tyranny, the most powerful weapon is often the courage to think differently. And that is why these tales must be told.